It was supposed to be the safest theater in the world. That is what they said. That is what was printed in the programs handed to more than 2,000 people who walked through the gilded doors of the Iroquois Theatre on the afternoon of the 30th of December, 1903. Absolutely fireproof. Those two words, pressed in clean black ink on white paper, handed to mothers holding children by the hand, handed to shop girls who had saved 2 weeks of wages for a Wednesday matinee, handed to schoolboys on holiday break who had never seen a live performance before and were trembling with excitement at the sheer scale of the lobby's marble columns. They believed it. Why would they not? The Iroquois was not merely a theater, it was a declaration, a monument built in deliberate defiance of the city's memory. Chicago had burned before catastrophically, legendarily, and the men who built the Iroquois wanted the world to know that era was finished. The building had cost $500,000. Its stone facade reached toward the sky in the Beaux-Arts style, all carved cornices and arched windows in the kind of architectural arrogance that whispers permanence. It had opened only 5 weeks earlier, on the 23rd of November, 1903. The reviews were rapturous. The crowds were enormous. The owners Benjamin Marshall, who designed it, Will Davis, who managed it, and the syndicate behind it were deeply, visibly proud. And on December 30th, they were not in the building. The show was Mr. Bluebeard, a spectacular musical extravaganza featuring the comedian Eddie Foy, one of the most beloved performers in America at the time. It was a children's holiday production. The matinee crowd was accordingly dense with families. The upper balconies, the gallery seats, the cheapest tickets in the house were packed wall to wall with working-class Chicagoans who could rarely afford such an afternoon. Women, children, young women who worked the counters at Marshall Field's department store, boys who had pooled coins together. The total count inside the building that afternoon has been estimated at between 1,900 and 2,100 people. The theater's legal capacity was 1,600. The fire started at approximately 3:15 inches the afternoon during the second act. A calcium arc light on the left side of the stage, one of the many stage lights used to create the show's elaborate visual effects, made contact with a piece of painted muslin scenery suspended above the stage. The contact was brief. The spark was small. A stagehand saw it immediately and attempted to beat it out. But the scenery was dry and light as paper, and the spark had already become a lick of orange flame, climbing fast up the fabric, catching the next curtain, and the next, feeding on the extraordinary amount of flammable material hanging in the rigging above the Iroquois stage. Later, investigations would reveal that the fly space above the stage, the area where all stage machinery, curtains, and scenery was rigged, contained somewhere between 280 and 300 pieces of painted scenery, most of them made of dried muslin and wood and hemp rope, all completely untreated with any fire-retardant material of any kind. The fly space was, in effect, a chimney packed with kindling. Down in the seats, the audience did not yet know what was happening. Some saw the flicker of orange above the stage curtain line. Most assumed it was part of the show. It was a spectacular production. Strange lights and dramatic effects had been part of the performance all afternoon. Eddie Foy was already watching from the wings, and he saw immediately that this was not a special effect. He stepped out onto the stage and did something that, in the accounting of history, would be credited with saving a portion of those 2,000 lives. He raised his hands. He told the audience in a calm and steady voice to remain in their seats. He called for the orchestra to keep playing. He understood instinctively that the greatest killer in a theater fire is not the fire itself. It is the crowd. But the fire did not cooperate with Eddie Foy's attempt at calm. The flames in the fly space were spreading with terrifying speed, and someone in the rigging pulled on the rope for the asbestos safety curtain, the bromatite curtain, which the theater had advertised as the primary fireproofing feature separating the stage from the audience. It was the one mechanism specifically designed for exactly this moment. The moment the house was in danger. The moment everything depended on a single barrier, dropping cleanly between the fire and the people. The curtain jammed. It descended perhaps halfway, maybe a little less. Witnesses later placed it at roughly 30 feet from the stage floor. leaving an enormous gap at the bottom through which the fire and, more critically, the superheated gas building in the fly space could flow freely. The reason it jammed was prosaic and mechanical, and entirely the result of carelessness. A guide wire on one side had not been properly installed. A piece of metal was bent at the wrong angle. The curtain snagged on the warped guide and stopped, and no one in the rigging could free it in time. And then a stagehand, in a decision that killed hundreds of people, opened the backstage door. The rear of the stage opened onto an alley. Fresh, cold Chicago air, December air, moving fast through the gap, rushed in from outside and hit the superheated pocket of oxygen-depleted gas and flame that had been building under the jammed curtain. What happened next is known in fire science as a backdraft. The entire composition of trapped gas and heat above the stage ignited almost simultaneously. A fireball, witnesses described as a wave, exploded outward from the stage, beneath the stuck curtain, and over the orchestra pit, and straight into the lower auditorium, at a temperature that later investigators estimated exceeded 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It traveled the length of the auditorium in seconds. Eddie Foy barely escaped into the wings. He would later testify that the heat on his face was like standing in front of a furnace, opened suddenly at close range. The orchestra musicians dove beneath the stage. Those who made it lived. Those who hesitated did not. In the upper balconies, the gallery, the second and third tiers, the situation was different. The fireball did not reach them in the first instant. What reached them was smoke. Thick, black, chemically toxic smoke rising fast from below, and with it, the primal understanding that something had gone catastrophically wrong. And those 2,000 people in the building, the women, the children, the shop girls, the schoolboys stood up from their seats all at once and moved toward the exits. And this is where the true nature of the disaster reveals itself. Because the Iroquois Theatre had been open for 5 weeks. In those 5 weeks, the building had not been completed. The city's fire inspector had conducted a visit and noted numerous deficiencies, but issued no orders to close the building or halt performances. The theater had no working fire alarm connected to the city's fire system. It had no telephone to the fire department. It had no sprinkler system. The sprinkler system had been planned, and the pipes had been roughed in, but the actual sprinkler heads had not been installed. Not one. The fire hoses backstage were present, but had not been connected to the water supply. When stagehands attempted to use them, they produced nothing. The exits. There were supposed to be sufficient exits. The theater had many doors. But in the 5 weeks since opening, management had adopted a policy common to theaters of the era, to prevent ticket holders from the cheaper gallery seats from sneaking down into the more expensive orchestra sections during intermission. Many of the interior connecting doors and exit doors had been fitted with a locking device called a bascule lock, an unfamiliar European mechanism that most Americans had never encountered. Unlike a standard push bar or lever, the bascule lock required the user to lift the handle upward before pushing the door open. Under ordinary conditions, it was a minor inconvenience. Under panic, in the dark, with smoke dropping the visibility to near zero, and hundreds of people pressing from behind, it was a death trap. People pushed. The doors did not open. People pushed harder. The crowd compressed against the closed doors. The pressure became crushing. People fell and could not rise. Some exits were locked entirely, not with bascule mechanisms, with actual chains and padlocks locked from the outside because management had not wanted people to enter without paying. Fire investigators found the bodies piled 6 and 7 deep against these doors after the building cooled. The ventilation system in the theater, the system designed to circulate air for the comfort of the audience, had, by its geometry, the effect of drawing air upward from the stage, through the ceiling, and into the upper galleries. When the fire and smoke entered the auditorium, the ventilation did not exhaust the toxic gas outward. It concentrated it in the upper tiers, where the cheapest seats were, where the working-class families sat, where the children sat. One alley exit, exit 33, running along the north side of the building, was unknown to most of the audience because it had no signage visible from inside the theater. Some patrons escaped through it. Others found it only by accident, hands trailing along the wall in the smoke. The steps leading down from the upper balconies to the main floor exits were steep and narrow, and in the crush, people fell, and those behind them fell over them, and the pile compounded. Later accounts from fire marshals described finding the stairwell on the east side of the building choked with bodies, not burned, not touched by flame, but suffocated or crushed. The Chicago Fire Department received no alarm from inside the theater. The first call came from a passerby on the street outside who saw smoke. The responding companies arrived within minutes, but those minutes were the difference between any kind of containment and what they actually found. When Engine Company 13 arrived and the firefighters forced their way inside, a fireman named John Campion later testified that the sight inside the lobby and lower corridors was unlike anything in his career. He did not elaborate further in official testimony. He simply said that the word he reached for did not exist. The fire itself was largely extinguished within 15 minutes of the fireball. 602 people were dead. The exact count was 602, confirmed by the Cook County Coroner's official report. It is the deadliest single-building fire in the history of Chicago. It killed more people than the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It remains one of the deadliest theater disasters in recorded history. Nearly all of the dead were found not in the auditorium itself, not burned at the seats, but at the exits, at the doors that did not open, at the stairwells, in the corridors, at the sealed chains. At the bascule, locks lifted the wrong way by 2,000 pairs of hands that had never seen one before. The average age of the dead was 19 years old. One woman, a Mrs. Peterson, had brought her 3 daughters to the matinee as a holiday treat. All 3 daughters, aged 7, 10, and 14, were among the dead. Mrs. Peterson survived. She testified before the coroner's inquest from a wheelchair and did not complete her statement. A school group of 16 children from the Chicago public school system had been given complimentary tickets by a local civic organization as a Christmas gift. 14 of the 16 were killed. Eddie Foy's son was in the audience that day, in the care of a theater employee. He survived. Foy himself, after escaping the stage, re-entered the building twice in attempts to assist people from the rear exits, an act that was widely reported but never officially recognized. In the weeks following the fire, the city of Chicago moved with extraordinary speed, not toward accountability, but toward appearance. Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. ordered an immediate investigation. City inspectors swept through every theater and public building in Chicago and found, almost universally, the same violations: locked exits, absent sprinklers, non-functional fire equipment, overcrowding. 30 theaters in Chicago were temporarily closed in the days following the Iroquois Fire. Most were reopened within weeks. The criminal proceedings were elaborate and ultimately empty. Theater manager Will Davis was indicted on charges of manslaughter. Building owner Harry Powers was indicted. The owner of the building company was indicted. The city's building commissioner, Edward Laughlin, who had issued the occupancy certificate for an incomplete building, was indicted. Fire Prevention Bureau head William Musham was indicted. Former Mayor Fred Buss, who had overseen some of the permitting process, was named in proceedings. In total, more than a dozen individuals were charged in connection with the deaths of 602 people. Not one was convicted. Not one served a single day in prison. The cases collapsed one by one. Charges were dropped, dismissed, or the statute of limitations was found to have run. The defense argued procedural flaws in the indictments. Judges ruled on jurisdictional questions. By 1905, every criminal case stemming from the Iroquois Theatre Fire had been closed without a conviction. The civil suits filed by the families of the dead were settled quietly, at amounts that the plaintiffs' attorneys described in contemporary newspaper accounts as grossly inadequate. The settlements were sealed and never fully disclosed. The theater itself, the Iroquois, was not demolished. It was renovated, renamed the Colonial Theater, and reopened. It continued to operate as an entertainment venue for decades. The building was eventually torn down in 1956, and a new structure, eventually to become the Oriental Theater, and later the Nederlander Theater, was built on the same site. Touring productions play there today. The address is 24 West Randolph Street, Chicago, Illinois. There is a small plaque on the exterior wall. It was installed in 2003, 100 years after the fire, following a campaign by the descendants of victims who spent several years petitioning the city. Before the plaque, there was nothing. No marker. No acknowledgement. The site of the deadliest single-building fire in Chicago's history had been, for a century, unmarked. What the Iroquois Fire produced, in terms of lasting consequence, was primarily legislative. Within months of the disaster, cities across the United States began revising their fire safety codes. The specific provisions enacted in direct response to the Iroquois Fire include the requirement for outward swinging exit doors on all public buildings, a regulation that seems so obvious, so elemental, that it is nearly impossible to imagine a world without it. The panic bar, the push to open exit hardware that now exists on virtually every public building on Earth, was developed and mandated in direct response to the jammed bascule locks at the Iroquois. The requirement for illuminated exit signs, the requirement for sprinkler systems in public assembly spaces, the prohibition on locking exit doors during occupancy. All of these emerged, at least in part, from the particular and specific ways in which 602 people died on the afternoon of the 30th of December 1903, which means that in almost every public building entered today, every cinema, every school, every concert hall, every sports arena, there are traces of 602 deaths in the design. Every lit green exit sign above a push-bar door is, in a sense, a monument to what the Iroquois Theatre took and what it left behind. But the laws arrived too late for the women and children who pressed their hands against the locked doors on Randolph Street. And the men responsible for those locked doors, for the absent sprinklers, for the jammed curtain, for the uninstalled connections on the fire hoses, for the certificate of occupancy issued to an unfinished building, those men walked free. They returned to their offices and their homes and their clubs. They gave interviews. Some expressed sympathy. Will Davis, the theater manager, told a reporter some weeks later that the fire had been a terrible tragedy and that he had personally lost significant money in the disaster. He was referring to his investment. He was never asked again about the bascule locks. He died in 1920, of natural causes, in a comfortable house on the north side of Chicago. The 602 dead of the Iroquois Theatre were buried in cemeteries across the city. Many of the graves, particularly those of the working-class victims from the upper gallery, are now unmarked. The stone has weathered or was never placed. The families who could not pay for a monument left none. The children who had saved their coins for a Wednesday afternoon in December are named only in the coroner's register, in the cold bureaucratic language of official mortality. Name, age, address, cause of death. Smoke and pressure. Smoke and pressure. Smoke and pressure. That is what the coroner wrote again and again down the list. The Iroquois Theatre Fire did not end with the last ember cooling on the 30th of December 1903. It ended, if it has ended, in the slow accumulation of regulations that mean the next 2,000 people in the next Grand Theater on the next Wednesday afternoon stand a chance that the shopgirls and the schoolboys on Randolph Street were never given. They were given a pamphlet, absolutely fireproof. 2 words, and the men who printed those words were never made to answer for them. That is what history recorded. That is what the plaque, in its careful and modest language, does not say. The building stands. The shows go on. And somewhere in the architecture of every theater in America, buried in the code requirements for door hardware and sprinkler spacing and exit sign lumens, the ghost of December 30th still presses against the wall, still lifts the handle the wrong way, in the dark, still waits for the door that will not open.